Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to the first session of our research colloquium. We're very happy to have with us our first speaker, a noisy colleague, Shona K. Tucker. Shona is an assistant professor in applied linguistics at OISE, University of Toronto. She got her PhD from the University of Oxford, which focused on the English writing development of primary school learners in Creole-speaking context, as well as the role of ecological factors, for example, pedagogy, language attitudes, home literacy environments in literacy. Her research and teaching focus on research methods in applied linguistics, literacy development in the Caribbean and other Creole contexts, second language writing, and the role of home literacy in student language development. You also received 2 articles from Professor Tucker to read, and join me in welcoming Professor Tucker for this presentation. Thank you, and the floor is yours, Shona.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I'm just going to start this presentation here. So thank you for having me. As Enrica shared, I am an assistant professor here, and the research that I'll be presenting today is from my thesis study that I did at the University of Oxford. So while everyone comes in, I'll just give you the rundown of the session. So the readings, first of all, that you did would have provided you with a good contextual base on the language situations in Creole contexts, as well as in low to middle income contexts where language and literacy operate in multilingual settings, but where children are often not educated in their home language, or the home language is not welcome in the classroom. So that's the context that we're working in. So we'll talk a bit about the context in Jamaica, the specific location of this study, and we'll go over the study, the methodology, the aims, and the findings. We'll also be discussing some limitations and the implications of this kind of research for further research, pedagogy, and policy. Feel free to ask your questions, maybe pop them in the chat, or we can discuss them after. So to start, to give you a context, in the Caribbean, we generally speak a Creole language, which is a form of contact language that some of you, if you have taken my classes, I've seen some of you, we've discussed that a little bit, where they came out of the slave trade, essentially, in the Caribbean, where a European language met with African languages in the Caribbean. So what happened is the British, in the case of the Anglophone Caribbean, colonized the Caribbean islands, and you had the slaves who spoke a bunch of different African languages that we'll talk about a bit more, needing to communicate with each other. And what this did is that it develops into a pidgin, which over time, when it becomes the native language of a group or a generation of people, it becomes a Creole, essentially, which is a separate language from English. And so what you have is a European superstrate, so the language that gives the vocabulary, it's also called a lexifier. And you have an African substrate, which contributes the grammar and the phonology. This is not a very neat and tidy cutoff, but generally this is the pattern. The biggest area of difference between the Creoles and the English, for example, is in the grammar. It's not the only area of difference, but that is the largest area of divergence that makes it a separate language. And so, let me move that. So to make it a bit clearer, language in the Caribbean in other Creole contexts is classified or viewed on a continuum. So a few Caribbean linguists like Bickerton have looked at it in this way, as a ladder, as we see in this image, where there's the absence of a clear boundary. And so what you see at the base of the ladder here is the basilect, which is essentially the purest form of the Creole, which perhaps an English speaker would not understand if they moved into Creole setting. In the middle, we have what is called the mesolect. And so that's where you see the most mixing between or code switching between the lexifier language, so English in this case, and the Creole itself. At the top of the ladder here, we have the acrolect, which is essentially, in the case of Jamaica, Jamaican Standard English, which is modeled based on British English. And so what that would look like in an example, to make it a bit clearer, is in the acrolect, if someone was speaking in standard English in Jamaica, standard in quotes, the person might say, I am eating. As you move down or move across that continuum, rather, you might have another person closer to the mesolect saying, I's eating. And then as you move across, you have I eating, then it moves to me eating, then me I eat, then me I am. So you can see as it moves across the continuum, it looks less and less like English, and essentially because it is not English. And so that's just to give you a clearer example. Speakers in these contexts have the ability to be proficient in one lect, as you call it. So for example, the basilect only, which you'll find in a lot of rural areas. Or they might be proficient in more than one lect. So someone might be able to speak English, but they also are quite proficient and are able to switch in between and kind of trans-language, operate in that type of space where you kind of switch between the language for different purposes or as you choose. So for Jamaica specifically, as I mentioned, there is what the language is called. So I'm not trying to say that English is the standard, but the language is called Jamaican Standard English or Standard Jamaican English. That's the official language, and it's the language of schooling, as well as generally the language of prestige. Then there is Jamaican Creole, and this is the language actually of the masses. The majority of people are either mesolectal or basilectal speakers. This language generally has lower prestige. That's a whole other area of study, how language attitudes are quite complex in this setting, but generally it is of lower prestige and economical value essentially, in terms of getting a job, getting into school, since English is the only official language. And so the lexifier language, the vocabulary comes from British English, and the substrate, so the grammar of the language and a lot of the phonology comes from the Kwa, Twi, and Bantu languages from Africa. It is primarily an oral language. The average Jamaican does not write in Creole in a standard orthography. They use the English orthography if it's in text or on social media, but generally no one writes except for the linguists. So generally you would say it's an oral language. There is, of course, the issue of standard language ideology where standard English is seen as better and of more value. And as a result, in the classroom, the home language of most students, as the Creole is spoken by the majority of people on the island, is denigrated and disregarded. So in terms of, this is also just to give you some context of how this might impact writing, which we will get to. In terms of grammar, I just chose a few examples to show the differences. So in Jamaican Creole, for example, tense is unmarked. And what that means is that in English, we mark tense to say, I walked. So we put an ED to indicate that it's something done in the past, for example. Or I went, we know that the went is saying it's in the past. In Jamaican Creole and in most Creoles, tense is not marked. So the person might say, me go yesterday. And that could mean that the yesterday would let you know that it's past tense, but often they might not add yesterday. You will just need to use context to know. There's also no subject-verb agreement or no requirement for subject-verb agreement. So the boy, you could say the boy run, and that could refer to a group of boys, one boy, And so unlike in English, where the subject and the verb need to agree, that's not present in the Creole. The Creole also uses serial verbs, which is a thread or series of verbs back to back. So carry the book, come give me, would be bring the book to me, but in English, we wouldn't say it like that. And then we also have copula deletion. So to be, the verb to be is not mandatory. So if you say, I am sick or he is sick, you just say, I sick or he's sick. And clearly, this has implications for writing, especially. In terms of phonology, there are differences, not as many as in the grammar, but there is epenthesis. So Creole doesn't like consonant clusters, so we'll simplify them. So instead of snake, we'll say snake, or Smith will turn to Simit. You add a little schwa in there. And we delete consonants as well to simplify consonant clusters, which results in tin becoming, or thin becoming tin, for example. So these are just some examples, not to overwhelm you with too much detail. So what this means for Jamaican children is summed up in this quote that I really love from a Jamaican poet called Mutabaruka, where he says, we write in a language that we do not speak, and we speak a language that we do not write. And so what that amounts to in literacy for Jamaican children is, over the years, writing has been the greatest area of challenge for learners across every level of education. Based on the most recent assessments from national exams, at the primary level, 56% of learners leave school, according to the Ministry of Education, not being able to write, which is a significant problem moving forward. Though this is such a problem, or we've lamented this over the years, very little research has been carried out in Creole context on a whole, but also at the primary level or on writing. Of the little research that has been done on literacy, it's definitely swayed towards reading. And so linguists and educational researchers in the Caribbean have called for the need to rely on second language learning research, given that essentially English is not the first language of a lot of these children. Another trend in the research, the little research that we have, is a focus on grammatical errors, which is somewhat understandable given that that's the biggest area of difference between the languages. But what that means is that we have a relatively strong understanding of the grammatical errors that are made by children due to the relationship between the languages. But that's really all we understand about writing, relatively. We haven't looked a bit broader, and we haven't considered other variables that might affect children's writing beyond grammatical errors. So another issue that this research serves to respond to is that we have a lot of research saying that the writing is poor, Creole-speaking children are poor at writing, this kind of narrative. But most of this research actually has not considered the really important variable of language dominance. The fact that not all Creole, or not all children in Creole-speaking environments speak Jamaican Creole as a home language, which is where in this reflexivity came into this study a lot for me, because I grew up in a home which I admit had a very strong standard language ideology, where I was not allowed to speak Jamaican Creole growing up. And so essentially Jamaican Creole was not my first language growing up, but a lot of the research has grouped all Jamaican children together to say, these are the issues these learners have, without considering that they're different populations that we're looking at. So we'll see how we address that moving forward. And so essentially, this research served to investigate the nature of writing, to just begin at the start, what is the nature of writing among learners at the primary level with Jamaican Creole as their home or dominant language? And what are the challenges they face, if any, in writing? since we have no research, let's start from the beginning there. The study also served to explore the ecology of the writing classroom, to understand what else is possibly going on that could be influencing writing and literacy outcomes. And so while there are many things that could have been looked at, I looked at teachers. So I did some interviews with teachers, as we'll see, and I also looked at the level of the writing or the English language curriculum and policy. So there are quite a few methods in this study, which is mixed methods, that we'll have a look at. And so to frame the study to begin with, I brought two theories together that I felt addressed the questions or the objectives in some measure. And the first one is a simple view of writing that some of you may be familiar with, which is essentially saying that writing is a complex task that consists of 3 different processes in a working memory environment. That a successful writer or a writer has to balance lower level transcription skills. So that would be handwriting, spelling, punctuation, as well as some higher level text generation skills, which would be at the word, sentence, or phrase, so vocabulary and grammar, and essentially organizing a text, as well as some executive functions. So it's a balancing act. But that tells us a lot about the learner and nothing else. And so another approach to writing, which I suppose, as I've read further, fits in with a complexity approach or theory view of writing, is taking an ecological approach. So stepping back a little bit and looking at the possible relationships between writing and the wider context that writing is situated in the Jamaican classroom. So by looking at the classroom, in the study, I also looked at home literacy environments, which we'll address a little bit later. But this is the general thing that takes into consideration learner factors, as well as a wider ecological understanding of writing. And so, as I shared before, the complexity of writing, that it's not only influenced by learner factors, but also it's linked to writing qualities linked to the nature of instruction. There's a lot of research showing that, as well as, I forgot to put the reference. That shouldn't be a question mark. I'll update that. But literacy outcomes are also highly correlated with factors such as socioeconomic status, particularly in low to middle income contexts, and home literacy practices. And just to qualify that, having low socioeconomic status does not mean that a child will have low or poor writing quality, as it's not a uniform constraint, but generally socioeconomic status does have a distal effect that it influences other things closer to writing. So it influences perhaps the amount of books in the home or that kind of thing, which we'll come to. And so taking that approach, the theoretical framework informed the research design directly. And so in phase 1, which I won't discuss much in this talk, the study started with a systematic review of writing generally for children across the world who are learning to write in English, but speak a different language at home. Of course, much of that research ended up being in the global north. And so I won't touch on that too much here, but that was a part of the study. Then in a progressive focusing manner, I went on to do a qualitative content analysis of the curriculum that guides writing instruction, as well as the policy that guides it, the language education policy. And then I moved a bit closer to the students by doing some interviews with their teachers to see what are their approaches, what are their concerns, what are their challenges, as well as then in the final stage, directly measuring or assessing essentially student writing. Home language and literacy questionnaires were a part of this study, but a note that I'll come to again later is that this study took place during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when school closures just happened. It was when the data collection started. So we'll see the effects of COVID throughout this study, but the home language and literacy questionnaires were not used for the purpose that they were collected for initially, but they have been used throughout the study to provide a really thick description of the context and to help in interpreting the findings. And so in the first stage, the content analysis, the general question was, what approach is taken by the Ministry of Education in Jamaica to support the writing development of learners with Jamaican Creole as a home language? And so this involved searching all the available documents to come up with a population of texts that would help to answer this, which meant meeting with school administrators, teachers across the island to see which texts are they using, which books is the government recommending, and the language education policy, of course. So in the end, it ended up being 3 documents: a language education policy, the language arts curriculum, and the supporting textbook. I won't go into too much detail about each document, but it's really important to point out the language education policy of Jamaica is quite a precarious one. And so at the start of the study, I sourced the policy, and it essentially is a transitional bilingualism policy, which means that the home language is allowed in the classroom, but solely as a bridge, excuse me, as a bridge to the target language. So not to celebrate it, to develop it, just as a bridge. So once we get to English, we do away with the home language. So essentially, that's the policy, that the home language exists to facilitate the development of English. The problem with this, so to start, is that this policy came into being because of the poor writing outcomes in Jamaica. And so the policy outlines the decision that I just discussed, the policy that they agreed on, as well as the needs of language learners in Jamaica, the nature of literacy instruction, or the nature that we should have, and the necessary teacher education to meet these goals. But then there was this one awkward finding that came out of this study, that halfway through, you realize that this document that has been moving around in academic circles actually is not a real document, it's just a draft. But this is not something that has been publicized. So halfway through the study, I realized in reading another analysis that it's just a draft document. And this is quite important because it shows the attitudes to language. And so what happened is the Ministry of Education published this policy, but when it went to Parliament, it was not approved because of the underlying premise that that Jamaica was a bilingual nation, that they were recognizing the home language of children. And so it was never approved since 2001. However, you will still see this document around. And so the key findings that came out of that across the 3 documents, so this image over here is just a sample from the code book that was used to analyze, of one of the code books used to analyze the documents, was that overall, the ministry takes a more generalized or monolingual approach to education in Jamaica, which means essentially no recognition of the home language. So the home language is just there to facilitate. The strongest and most dominant theme across all the documents was, without a doubt, English immersion or submersion. So flood of English for students, for them to learn and absorb the language in that way, and keeping the home language away, especially from writing. So you saw sprinklings of the home language in the oral component of the curriculum here and there, but it was not in the writing section. And where you did see it in other sections, it was only listed as an attainment target, but it was never acted on throughout the curriculum. So the main takeaway for that is a monolingual approach to education. Moving on to the actual classroom or fieldwork research, which was online because data collection was in February 2021. Yes, so that was in the height of school closures. And so at this point, the government in Jamaica had reported that they were not able to account for over 120,000 students in the primary education system. And that might sound like a small number maybe to you, but keep in consideration that this is an island. So that's quite a large amount of children that you cannot account for at this point. And so the Minister of Education published a statement saying, we know that there are many challenges facing parents. We know that not everyone has proper connectivity. And even in cases where they do, they may not have the money for data plans. And so this somewhat shaped the study, and you have to interpret the findings with that in mind. Even for the students who did partake in the study, there were issues with access to internet and the intermittent electricity outages. So that's the context. So this study took place in a rural town. That's the school, the empty school that I did most of my online teaching from by myself. It was taking place in 2 local schools in a rural town. There was no significant difference in the nature of the schools or the socioeconomic status or anything like that. It just happened to be this school is in the north, this school is in the south in this small town. And so the town has a relatively flat SES. So people leave to go for higher education. It's a market town, so people generally work in markets or in small businesses, that kind of thing. There were 90 students in the study, all in grade 6. So they were all preparing for their final exams to move on to high school. And there were 10 teachers. So to integrate the different phases, the teachers were the classroom teachers of these students who participated. With the teachers, I carried out semi-structured interviews over Zoom, looking on themes including the instructional approaches that they used, their understanding of learners' challenges, their training for teaching literacy or writing specifically in a Creole context, and their attitudes towards the use of the home language in the classroom. In terms of classroom data, all the students' measures were administered during their language arts session. So a teacher was present. They were all taking place on Google Meet with cameras on. Generally, some students simply, because of technical difficulties, could not have their camera on. So that is a limitation in the study, that for a quantitative study where you try to control as many variables as possible, that was not possible in this case. Slight adaptations had to be made to some measures just because it was online and copyright issues. And all the work was submitted through Google Forms, and except for the writing, which required much more ethical approval, where students had to take pictures of their text, or their parents would take pictures of their work and submit it to me, to a phone number that I provided, after many trials of it not working before. So the instruments included the core measure being a narrative writing task. Background measures included nonverbal IQ and English language proficiency. There is no measure of Jamaican language proficiency, and so that was not included, as that would prove more difficult for students. And then a home literacy questionnaire was sent out to parents as well. Methodologically speaking, in the Caribbean, a possible reason for the lack of this type of research is that, as I showed you before on the ladder or the continuum, it's very difficult to determine a learner's dominant language, as you might if in another context like the Global North, where it's very clear-cut whether a child's, not very, but more clear-cut whether a child speaks, for example, Mandarin as a home language and English as a second language. In the Caribbean, it's on a continuum, so there wasn't much research. So what I had to do was create a triangulated approach to trying as best as possible to put students into groups so that we could really see how to support students who are more dominant in Jamaican Creole. So that included having teacher reports, a grammaticality judgment test, which I created, which is essentially, if you're not familiar with those, a test where you decide whether a sentence is grammatical or not. And so I created that, including the common grammatical patterns in Jamaican Creole for students to say whether this was correct in English or not, to be able to check whether students leaned more to the Jamaican Creole dominance or English. And there was also a language background questionnaire. And so students completed a writing prompt. And so essentially, because of the times we were living in, students were asked to imagine that after the COVID-19 pandemic, you could go anywhere on a trip with your family. You could go anywhere at all. Write about where you would go and the things you would do. And so students had 15 to 20 minutes to complete this task before completing the others. And so now I'll just give you an overview of all the findings, the main findings of the study and how they kind of come together. In terms of the contextual findings, so for parents completing the home literacy environment, this was initially supposed to be used as a covariate, which is essentially when I would be comparing the groups to see the differences in the writing, I wanted to control for the effects of home literacy environment because they are known to influence literacy outcomes. However, because of COVID and not being able to see parents in person, there was a mismatch in how many parents completed the survey and their children who completed the writing, which was the most important task. And so there weren't enough of, even though 114 parents completed it, it wasn't enough to do an analysis on the students who actually participated. And so I kept it in to describe the context. So generally the trends that we're seeing were parental education. There were generally low levels of education, particularly for the mothers. A lot of them had primary levels of education. In terms of literacy activities, very few parents engaged in formal literacy activities for various reasons. Some parents wrote me notes, which was very kind, just to explain that there were many jobs to provide for their family, and so they find it really difficult. So they had various reasons. Some parents wrote notes saying that they find their own literacy challenges come in the way of them helping students at home. So very different views. As a result, most parents believe that the teacher was central, that the teacher's job is to teach, and their job is just to encourage students. It's not to be necessarily doing any literacy activities at home. An interesting trend that emerged that I added because of the context was student attendance at Sunday school, which is a religious activity for Christians. Jamaica is a Christian country. So it turned out that among all the literacy practices that were involved and listed, this was by far the most common one, which highlights an area for further research. So in terms of teachers' main concern for children was that they write the way they speak. And so particularly in the grammar and in vocabulary, teachers felt that students used Creole forms, and that was their general challenge. One teacher named organization linked to the free-flowing way of the Creole in how students spoke. None of these were tested empirically. These are teachers' views, but they were substantiated in the writing samples of students to some extent. Teachers also complained about compositional length, which we can see here. This is not an uncommon length for some of the submissions students sent, which we'll talk about as we discuss the findings, that compositional length is linked to a lot of other challenges in spelling, handwriting, and other things. So it is linked to other challenges. In terms of instructional approaches, like the curriculum and the policy, teachers did take a monolingual approach to writing instruction. And so there was a lot of immersion, so extensive modeling of samples on the blackboard and that kind of thing, a focus on higher order skills, so planning, ideas, and key was also ad hoc correction of the home language, which means essentially when students would produce Creole in their writing, not intentionally, or in their speech, teachers would randomly correct but not explain the underlying cause for the error. So they would just say, fix that or correct it, or that's wrong, but they would never say, this is because in the Creole, tense is unmarked, for example. You would not hear that type of thing. But there was one hopeful teacher who, I must note, was not educated in Jamaica and noted that she had a keen interest in research. So she used drama and translanguaging to teach writing in her classroom, which I think is an area that deserves further exploration. As we've seen, drama and translanguaging can support literacy in general. And so what she did, you don't have to read that, there's a lot of Creole in there, but what she did is that essentially she would allow the students before writing, she would give them a topic. And I think the example she provided was an argumentative paper where they were talking about deforestation. And this side talks about they're for deforestation, the other side was against, for example, and they argued their points in their home language. And then after arguing them and the students had a good time, they all sat down and wrote those ideas down, and they were allowed to write it in the Creole as a first draft, however they wanted to. So they could use English as you do in translanguaging, using all their linguistic repertoire. And so after they did that, in the final drafts, then she allowed them all to translate together, to translate from the Creole into English. And she reported that the students not only liked this approach more and had a fun time, but they felt that their language was valued. And she felt that her class was better in terms of performance than all the others, which I did not test, but that was her view. But it is worth exploring. Relatedly, teachers generally felt ill-equipped to teach, because what I realized in our teacher systems, in our training colleges, we use a British system. So you are trained to teach as if you are teaching students who speak only English at home, at school, everywhere, a monolingual approach. So teachers, when they come to the classroom, reported that they didn't know what to do with the home language, especially when it came to writing. And teachers reported low confidence in their own writing skills. 7 out of 9 teachers said they felt very insecure and uncomfortable teaching writing because of their own challenges. And they also reported, also linked to COVID, that there are very limited opportunities for students to engage in extended or creative writing. Because with COVID, you'd have to send it and parents end up doing it for the students, and a host of challenges. But even when class is in normal session, the large class sizes make it almost impossible to mark or assess all the students' work. Finally, in terms of teachers, when it came to language attitudes, teachers generally were unanimous that the Creole did not have a place in the writing classroom. It served the purpose of comprehension if there was a breakdown and for scolding students, but it did not have a place, except for that one teacher who felt that she could use it. So teachers voiced concerns mainly around the fact that they won't have perfect writing until Patois or Jamaican Creole is established. It has to keep being English. None of the teachers knew that the language education policy existed, but when I did tell them about it, a teacher was very offended by it and felt that it was just lip service on the part of the government. It's not the reality in our country to say that we are a bilingual nation and that the home language can support the target language. And so we see that there is consistency in the idea of monolingual education or immersion, but there is not consistency in the valuing of the home language, which the language education policy purported that there should be a valuing of the home language. That was not seen. And so, as Pulsini notes, we're in the absence of a firm policy, language attitudes often become the policy, the invisible policy in classrooms, which is what is observed here. And so finally, in terms of the students now in the final phase, overall, writing scores were relatively low across the group. So the English dominant and the Creole dominant, where for Creole students, the average was around 45%, and for the English dominant, around 64%. There was, however, a really large difference between the groups in terms of the effect size, but there was still a lot of variation. The link to that, the Jamaican Creole students obviously tended to have lower oral proficiency scores than the English dominant students. And so what that looked like is in the assessment of the writing across every area, the learners with Jamaican Creole as a home language were performing at a lower level, especially in the oral language skills of grammar and vocabulary, where you see the distributions are very separate. There's not much overlap. And so the lower ratings are on this end. I couldn't get it to spread across in R, but that's the general thing. That 98 vocabulary, surprisingly, was a challenge for the Jamaican Creole students, 3 times more than the English dominant students. And grammar, lower scores were earned by the Jamaican Creole students. 98% of them gained low scores in grammar, compared to 56% of the English dominant students. And so to bring it all together, this study was largely exploratory. And so a lot of further work is needed to hone into some of these variables. But what can be seen is that, as predicted by the simple view of writing that says deficits in the lower level scales results in deficits in the higher level, because it takes so much more cognitive ability to process the lower level skills that enough attention can't be paid to higher level execution. And so that was seen that students had significantly lower scores in spelling, handwriting, and vocabulary, all the scores. And so what happened is, in their overall writing, their scores tended to be lower. There was evidence of the L1 coming through in the English writing unintentionally, so more in the form of errors. And so importantly, a similar profile was observed between the Jamaican Creole dominant learners and learners more typically described as EAL or ELL, which is important because the government needs to recognize that these students are a different population who need specific support, that they have a different L1 or first language, and they need support. They need their language to be valued and recognized, and they need support just like any other second language speaker. There were other factors that weren't considered, such as motivation, but that was seen in the study, where the study started with 100 and about 90 students, but only 90 completed the writing tasks. And teachers made it very clear that the students disliked writing. In terms of instruction, the monolingual or undifferentiated approach taken likely had an effect on writing. The ad hoc or random correction of the home language, or scolding of the home language rather than distinguishing between the two, also likely played a role. And the teacher's own views of the home language not belonging and not being welcomed in the classroom affects how students write. So they could not use the home language as a resource in their writing, and so students could only depend on English. There were also the unmeasured effects of COVID-19 on writing that I suppose in years to come, we'll see that a bit more clearly. And then finally, in terms of home literacy factors, parent illiteracy emerged as a strong factor in this study, in this rural community, and parents' beliefs about their participation in literacy, where they didn't feel that they needed to play a role in this. And so this is just to highlight a few of the limitations in the study, which are mostly tied to COVID, that in moving research online, it makes it difficult to monitor certain things, such as perhaps cheating or in different tasks, not necessarily the writing. There is the issue of selective bias of who was included in the study and who was excluded from the study because they couldn't access internet for a sustained amount of time. I did secure funding to help pay for students to access the internet, but that was entirely up to the schools to give that to the parents. So you still can't measure how much some students truly were excluded. And so a full picture is not necessarily there. We have a general idea, general exploratory idea of what writing might look like, but we still have a ways to go. And so based on the findings for future research, it is recommended that we move away from this singular focus on students' grammatical errors to a more holistic view so that we can have a broader scope of how to support students. Teacher training programs likely need intervention studies to see how can we train teachers to appreciate the home language? How can we include this in their training to support Creole speakers? Translanguaging is likely a really good and useful resource that can be implemented in the Caribbean and as it has in other contexts, but that would take buy-in from the government and from society at large, considering the negative attitudes towards the home language, which could likely be addressed, at least in part, by a clear articulation of a language policy, a ratified language policy that supports learners and values their linguistic resources, sees their language as a resource. Because if the government doesn't recognize it, it's very unlikely that teachers will value it or society will value it. And so we also need some awareness initiatives concerning the benefits of including the home language in the classroom and celebrating children's languages for us to move forward in translanguaging or whatever it might be in order to support learners. So that was a quick sort of overview of this study. I think that's the last thing. I will update the references. And any questions? That's it from me.
Wow, thank you very much. This was really interesting.